There are mistakes that cost you your wallet, mistakes that cost you your ribs, and mistakes that make you vanish from the face of the earth without anyone caring enough to look for you. When 3 drunken men cornered a trembling waitress against the wall of an empty bar in the middle of a Boston winter night, they thought they'd found the easiest prey in the world. They didn't know that the woman they were tormenting still made cocktails every Friday night for the most powerful mafia boss on the east coast of America. The amber neon sign of the amber glass had lost its letter G since last summer, turning it into the amber lass, blinking weakly through the layer of snow clinging to the window. It was just past 11 o'clock p.m. on a skin-cutting cold Tuesday night in the middle of February, and the wind from Boston Harbor hissed through the cracks of the bar door like the whistle of something bringing bad luck. Inside, Jolene Caldwell, 28 years old, was leaning against the oak bar, her old sneakers worn so thin the soles were peeling, silently screaming after nearly 10 straight hours of carrying trays. Around her neck swung a tarnished silver chain, threaded through a wedding ring she'd taken off her finger 2 years ago, ever since the night a phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning stole everything she'd ever had. Jolene was the kind of woman carved out of breaking points, widowed at 26, raising her 5-year-old daughter Penny alone, a little girl with mild autism spectrum disorder. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning hotel rooms by day and mixing cocktails by night, just to keep the lights on in their cramped apartment and make sure her daughter didn't miss a single speech therapy session. Every day she prayed that her old, rusted silver Honda Civic would hold together just long enough to get them to the clinic. She wasn't easy to knock down, but the thing she valued more than anything was respect. She gave it to everyone who walked through the bar door, whether they wore a suit or a prison uniform. And that simple, ordinary respect had accidentally made her someone protected by the organization the whole city didn't dare name. If you like stories that make you hold your breath from beginning to end, hit like right now. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. That story about respect began 8 months before that fateful night, on a Friday evening in the middle of summer, when the amber glass was packed wall to wall with customers, and the jazz music, coming from the old speaker in the corner of the bar, was almost swallowed whole by laughter, voices, glasses clinking against glasses, and chairs scraping across the wooden floor. Jolene was making a gin and tonic for the customer sitting at the far end of the bar when the door opened, and a group of 4 men walked in. They weren't loud. They didn't try to draw attention, but there was something in the way they moved that made the crowd automatically drift aside without anyone understanding why. It was as if the whole room instinctively recognized that these men took up more space than their bodies should have allowed. Black suits, polished leather shoes, slow steps. But every footfall carried the weight of men who'd never had to hurry. Denise, the night shift manager, appeared at Jolene's side at once, her red fingernails digging into Jolene's arm as she whispered in a trembling voice, "Those are Valentini's men. Serve them, then stay away. Don't look at them. Don't talk to them. Don't do anything stupid." Jolene looked at Denise, then looked back at the group of men heading toward the VIP room behind the dark red velvet curtain. She didn't know who Valentini was. To her, the name sounded no different from the label of some wine she'd never tasted. All she saw were 4 customers who needed service, and a Friday night shift wasn't the time to stand around gossiping. She pulled Denise's hand off her arm, picked up 4 leather-bound menus, and walked straight through the velvet curtain. The VIP room at the Amber Glass wasn't large, just big enough for 1 round table and 6 chairs, with warmer yellow lighting than the rest of the bar, and an exposed red brick wall holding an old black and white photograph of Boston Harbor from the 40s. The man sitting in the seat facing the doorway, his back against the wall, was the first person Jolene saw when she lifted the curtain and stepped inside. He was about 6 feet 1 inch tall, with neatly cut black hair slicked back, a sharp hairline, and a square jaw covered with a short beard trimmed carefully down to the millimeter. But what made Jolene pause for half a breath was his eyes. Dark gray, deep, and completely unreadable. The kind of eyes you looked into only to realize you were staring at a closed door. Nico Valentini. Of course, Jolene didn't know his name then. Sitting on his right was a man Jolene had to look up at to fully take in, even though he was seated. About 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a neck as thick as a utility pole and shoulders so broad the wooden chair beneath him looked like a child's toy. His nose bent slightly to the left, the trace of so many breaks that the bone no longer seemed to care about growing back straight. Barrett Mancini. And on the other side of the table, almost blending into the shadows in the corner of the room, was a thin, tall man with a narrow face like the edge of a knife, so quiet that Jolene almost didn't realize he was sitting there. But when he tilted his head toward the light, Jolene saw the scar. It ran from the left corner of his mouth almost to his ear, smooth, shiny, old, as if someone long ago had tried to carve a smile onto his face that he'd never asked for. Tomas Ricci. Jolene placed the menus on the table and smiled the way she smiled at every customer. Not too warmly, not too coldly, just enough to make the person across from her feel welcomed without feeling bothered. "Good evening. What can I get for you, gentlemen?" Barrett was the first to order. "Macallan." "Neat." Jolene didn't write it down right away. She looked at Barrett and asked in an ordinary voice, as if she were asking whether a customer wanted sugar or milk in his coffee. 12-year or 18? Barrett stopped. It was a brief moment, almost too small to matter, but long enough for Jolene to realize her question had surprised him. Few people asked. Most bartenders in small places like this would pour whatever bottle was sitting on the shelf. 18, Barrett answered. "If you have it." Jolene did. She poured exactly 2 fingers of whiskey into a heavy glass and brought it over with a small plate of salted roasted nuts that Bert, the old cook, still made by hand every afternoon. "My cook says good liquor deserves something worthy beside it," Jolene said, setting the plate down on the table. Barrett looked at the plate of nuts, then looked at Jolene, and for the first time that evening, one corner of his mouth lifted, almost like a smile. Nico didn't order anything for the first 10 minutes. He sat still, his dark gray eyes following Jolene as she moved back and forth between the VIP table and the bar. He didn't look at her the way men usually looked at women in a bar. He studied her the way someone assessed character, measuring honesty through every small gesture. Finally, he ordered an old-fashioned, said nothing more, and Jolene made it for him without asking another question. The whole group left the bar at around 1 o'clock in the morning. Jolene cleared the VIP table, wiped the glasses, and straightened the chairs. When she bent down to wipe the foot of the table, her hand brushed against something hard underneath. A black leather wallet, real leather, heavy in her palm. She opened it. Inside was a stack of cash she had to count twice because she didn't believe her own eyes. $15,000. And tucked into the small pocket at the back was an old Polaroid photograph, yellowing at the edges, showing a boy around 7 or 8 years old, in a white shirt standing beside a middle-aged woman with black hair. The woman in the photograph had eyes exactly like the dark gray eyes Jolene had served drinks to only hours earlier. No identification, no credit cards, nothing but cash and the photograph. Jolene sat down in the VIP chair, holding the wallet in one hand, while her other hand rose unconsciously to her chest, where the wedding ring on the chain around her neck was pressing lightly against her breastbone. $15,000. That amount would pay for 4 months of Penny's speech therapy. It would be enough for Jolene to stop working the daytime hotel housekeeping shift for a while, enough for her to sleep more than 4 hours a night. No one knew she'd found this wallet. Denise had gone home long ago. Bert was washing pots in the kitchen. The security camera in the VIP room had been broken since last month, and no one had fixed it. She could keep this money, and not one soul on earth would ever know. Jolene looked at the Polaroid photograph one more time. The boy in the picture was smiling, the kind of smile children had when they were standing beside the person they loved most in the world. She closed the wallet, walked to the safe behind the bar, locked it inside, and waited. 1 week. The following Friday, Nico's group returned at the same time, to the same table, with the same drinks. Jolene stepped through the velvet curtain and placed the black leather wallet on the wooden table in front of Nico. "You left this behind last week," she said, her voice as ordinary as if she were returning a lighter. Barrett picked up the wallet, opened it, counted the money, and checked the photo pocket. Not a single dollar was missing. The Polaroid was still in its place, not shifted by even 1 millimeter. Barrett looked up at Jolene with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between surprise and something that almost resembled respect. Nico took back the wallet. He didn't thank her, didn't ask questions, didn't show emotion. He only gave one single slow nod, then looked at Jolene for exactly 1 more second, the kind of look whose weight she could feel against her skin, before turning back to order a drink as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and they both knew it. At the end of that night, when the bar had thinned out and Jolene was wiping down the counter, Barrett Mancini walked over alone. He didn't sit down. He pulled a small white card from the pocket of his suit jacket, with no name, No title, only a phone number printed in black ink, and placed it on the counter in front of Bert, the old cook who was drying his hands on the towel draped over his shoulder. "Call this number if anything happens at the bar," Barrett said, his voice low and solid, like the sound of a steel door closing. "Anytime." Bert looked at the card, then looked up at the enormous man standing in front of him. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what kind of thing might happen. He only nodded, slipped the card into the pocket of his apron, and went back to wiping pots. He didn't think there would ever be a day he'd have to use it. 3 months after the night of the wallet, on a late autumn evening, Tomas Ricci drove his black sedan slowly down the sloping street that led toward the harbor. He was on his way back from a long meeting in the North End when the yellow light from the amber glass slipped into the corner of his eye through the car window. He slowed down by instinct, not because of the bar, but because of the figure standing in front of its door. Jolene. She stood there in the cold, without a coat, both hands on her hips, facing 2 strange men leaning against the brick wall right beside the entrance. Tomas couldn't hear what she was saying through the closed car window, but he could see her body language clearly, her back straight, refusing to step back, one finger pointing straight toward the street, as if she were ordering the 2 men to get lost. And they did get lost. They shoved each other, muttered under their breath, then dragged their feet away and disappeared around the corner. Jolene watched until they were gone, then turned back into the bar and shut the door behind her. She didn't know Tomas was sitting in the car 30 meters away. She also didn't know those 2 men were doing business on territory where they hadn't asked anyone for permission. Tomas sat still for 1 more minute, looking at the closed door of the bar, then drove away. He didn't tell Jolene, but that night, when he sat across from Nico in the private meeting room in the North End, he said one sentence Nico remembered. "The waitress at your bar has more guts than the men down at the harbor." Nico didn't answer. He only nodded. The kind of nod those close to him knew meant the information had been stored in a place where it would never be erased. 3 more months later, Christmas Eve. Boston sank beneath the snow. Snowflakes as large as coins drifted slowly through the yellow streetlights, covering car roofs, sidewalks, and everything else, until the whole city looked as though someone had laid a thick white blanket over it. The amber glass was empty. Denise had asked to leave early at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, using a headache as her excuse, though everyone knew she only wanted to get home in time for dinner with her family. Only Jolene remained behind the bar, and Bert remained in the kitchen. 2 lonely shadows keeping the little bar from being swallowed whole by the dark. Jolene wiped the same glass for the 3rd time, not because it was dirty, but because her hands needed something to do so her mind wouldn't think about the empty apartment waiting for her, about the high chair where Penny still sat for breakfast, about the second Christmas without Keith. She was getting ready to close, her hand already reaching for the sign light switch, when the bar door opened. Cold wind and snow rushed in at the same time as a man. Nico Valentini stepped over the threshold, alone. No Barrett beside him, no Tomas silent behind him, no 2 men blocking either side. Only him, his black wool coat dusted with snow across the shoulders, his dark gray eyes blinking faintly when the warmth of the bar touched his face. For the first time in 8 months of serving this group, Jolene saw Nico alone, and for the first time, he didn't walk into the VIP room. He sat down on the high stool right in front of the bar, placed both hands on the oak surface, and looked at Jolene. "Good evening, Mr. V," Jolene said, setting a coaster down in front of him. "What are you having tonight?" "You choose for me." Jolene looked at him for 1 second. In 8 months, Nico had always ordered an old-fashioned, unchanged, without hesitation. Tonight, he didn't want to choose. Maybe he'd chosen too many things that day, that week, that year. And on Christmas Eve, he only wanted someone else to choose something simple for him. Something as small as a drink. Jolene made him an old-fashioned, but she added a slice of fresh orange instead of the dried orange peel she usually used, and she poured a generous splash of bourbon. She set the glass in front of him without explaining. Nico took a sip, and the corner of his mouth shifted just enough for Jolene to know she'd chosen right. From the kitchen, Bert carried out a small plate, a warm slice of pecan pie, its top golden, the scent of butter and brown sugar spreading through the empty bar like heat. He set the plate on the counter beside Nico's drink and called from the kitchen doorway in his familiar, raspy voice. "No one should drink alone on Christmas Eve without something sweet, my friend." Then he turned back into the kitchen, without waiting for an answer, without waiting for money, without waiting for thanks. Bert gave away that slice of pie the way he gave away everything in life, quietly and without conditions. Nico looked at the plate, then he cut off a small piece with his fork, slowly, and ate it. He finished that slice of pie in silence, and Jolene stood behind the bar wiping glasses in silence, and Bert washed pots in the kitchen in silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence of two strangers who didn't know what to say. It was a rare, comfortable silence, the kind that existed only between people who didn't need to fill every empty space with words just to prove they were sitting beside one another. Nico sat at the bar for nearly 1 hour. He didn't order a second drink. He didn't make a phone call. He didn't check his messages. He only sat there, in the little bar beside the harbor, listening to the soft fall of snow beyond the window and the low jazz from the old speaker. And for the first time in a very long time, he looked like an ordinary man having a drink on Christmas Eve, not the boss of anything. When Nico stood up, he put his coat back on, nodded goodbye to Jolene, and walked to the door. He didn't say, "Merry Christmas." He didn't say, "See you again." He didn't need to. Beneath the empty old-fashioned glass, Jolene found 5 neatly folded $100 bills. She looked at the money, then looked out through the window, where Nico's shadow was fading into the snow. She knew tonight wasn't about the money. $500 meant nothing to a man like that. But sitting still for an hour in an empty bar on Christmas Eve, eating a slice of pecan pie made by an old cook, listening to jazz through a crackling speaker, that was something money couldn't buy. That was the first Christmas Eve in 4 years that Nico Valentini hadn't sat alone in his empty penthouse, on the 23rd floor, looking down at a frozen city. From that night on, everything changed in the way only true changes ever change, slowly and without noise. Every Friday night, Nico and his crew came to the Amber Glass, usually after meetings at their familiar restaurant in the North End, only a 12-minute drive away. They sat in the VIP room, ordered the same drinks, and Jolene served them with the same calm she gave to anyone else. Little by little, she learned who Nico was, not from him, because he never talked about himself. She learned from news clips on television that she happened to overhear, from the whispers of regular customers when the black convoy parked outside the bar, from the way the whole neighborhood changed every Friday night, shops closing earlier, pedestrians crossing the street to keep their distance, even the stray cats disappearing as if they, too, understood the hierarchy. Jolene knew all of it, and she didn't change. She wasn't afraid. She didn't judge. She wasn't too curious. She called him Mr. V, and he called her Jolene. Not sweetheart, not honey, not darling, just her name, pronounced clearly, in a voice she recognized as respect in its purest form. And that was exactly what made Nico Valentini respect her more than anyone outside his organization. Because in Nico's world, where people either feared him or wanted something from him, or both, a woman standing behind a bar who treated him like an ordinary human being was rarer than diamonds at the bottom of Boston Harbor. But that Tuesday night wasn't Friday night. There was no black convoy parked in front of the bar. There was no Barrett sitting in the VIP room with a glass of 18-year Macallan. There was no Tomas standing silently in the corner like a shadow that knew how to breathe. And there certainly was no Nico Valentini. A Tuesday night in the middle of February at the Amber Glass was the kind of night when the small bar by the harbor existed in its saddest form. A few scattered groups of customers, the jazz music from the old speaker sounding clearer than usual, because there weren't enough human voices to drown it out, and Jolene standing behind the bar, counting down every minute until closing. At 9 o'clock in the evening, while the bar still had customers at 3 tables, the door opened and 3 men walked in. They didn't draw attention. They weren't loud, weren't aggressive, and there was nothing about them that made Jolene look up a second time beyond the reflexes of her job. 3 men walking into a bar on a Tuesday night, ordering 3 bottles of beer, sitting at the middle table. The most ordinary thing in the world. Jolene brought the beers over, set down 3 coasters, asked if they wanted to see the food menu, received the answer, no, just beer, and went back to the bar. The most ordinary thing in the world. But Jolene had a habit of watching, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. When you work enough night shifts in a bar, you start reading customers the way sailors read the surface of the sea, not to admire it, but to know when it's time to head for shore. The man sitting in the middle, the leader, had a long face, high cheekbones, and dirty blonde hair plastered to his forehead as if he hadn't washed it in days. A piece of his left front tooth was chipped, showing every time he smiled. And he smiled often, but the smile never reached his eyes. His eyes were pale gray, the gray of dishwater, and they never stayed still. Even while he was talking to the two men with him, those eyes kept moving across the room, sweeping over the cash register, the camera in the corner of the ceiling, the front door, the kitchen door, the emergency exit. They were the eyes of a man who had gone in and out of too many places where he hadn't been welcome, Shane Pryor. Of course, Jolene didn't know his name then. Sitting to Shane's right was a large man, thick, bellied, with a short neck that was almost not there at all, and a heavy beard covering the lower half of his face. His arms were covered in tattoos, playing cards, skulls, a snake coiled around bone. The kind of tattoos Jolene had seen often enough to know they hadn't been done in a shop, but pricked into skin with a homemade needle inside a cell. Dwight Huxley. He drank beer by tipping the bottle straight back, draining half of it in one swallow, then setting it down on the table so hard Jolene could hear the bottom of the bottle strike the wood from behind the bar. And sitting last, almost folded into the corner of the table, was the youngest one. Thin, covered in acne, with sunken eyes and dark circles beneath them. The face of someone who didn't sleep enough, or put too many things into his body that never should have gone there, or both. He sat restlessly, one foot tapping lightly against the wooden floor over and over, and every few minutes his hand moved to the back of his waistband, adjusting something beneath his faded denim jacket. Jolene noticed that movement. She recorded it somewhere in her mind, not analyzing it yet, not naming it yet, only storing it by instinct, the same way the body remembers the place of a staircase in the dark. Cody Feltz. At 9 o'clock, those three men were just three men drinking beer. At 10 o'clock, the bar began to empty out. A group of four paid their bill and left, leaving the tip beneath a glass, and Jolene cleared the table. A middle-aged couple near the door were still sipping wine, speaking softly, laughing now and then. At 10:30, only that couple remained, along with the three men at the middle table and Jolene. Bert was scrubbing pots in the kitchen, the steady sound of metal scraping metal, carrying through the kitchen door that had been left slightly open. Denise had disappeared into the back office 15 minutes earlier, using inventory as an excuse, taking her phone and coffee with her, then closing the door. At 10:45, the couple near the door asked for the check. Jolene brought the bill over, took their card, ran it through the machine, and returned it. They put on their coats, wished her a good night, and stepped out into the snow. The door closed behind them, the bell gave one soft tremble, then went still, and the amber glass was empty. Only Jolene remained, with Bert in the kitchen, Denise behind the closed office door, and the three men at the middle table. 11 o'clock at night, Jolene was washing glasses behind the bar when she heard it. Not a specific sound, but a change in the air, like the way you feel the pressure shift before a storm arrives, even though the sky is still clear. Shane's voice grew louder, not loud in a cheerful way, but loud in a testing way, the way an animal sniffs the air to see whether anyone will react, whether anyone is listening, whether anyone will do something. He ordered more beer, but instead of raising his hand like before, he called straight out to Jolene, even though she had never told him her name. "Hey, bartender," he called, dragging out the words, his pale gray eyes no longer moving around the room, but fixed directly on Jolene. "Bring us 3 more, sweetheart." That was the first sweetheart. And Jolene had worked long enough to know that sweetheart from the mouth of a drunk man at 11 o'clock at night in an empty bar was never just sweetheart. Dwight leaned back in his chair, spreading his legs wide enough to take over the whole aisle between the rows of tables, the muddy soles of his boots propped against the crossbar of the chair across from him. Cody was still restless, but his eyes were no longer on the front door. He was looking toward the kitchen door, where fluorescent light leaked through the narrow gap, where Bert was scrubbing pots without knowing that 3 pairs of eyes had begun to calculate. Jolene placed the glass she had just washed on the shelf, wiped her hands on a towel, and stood still for 1 second behind the bar. She could feel it clearly now, that nameless sense people who worked night shifts, developed after thousands of hours spent standing alone in empty places with every kind of person. It was like the way animals smelled a storm before the sky had time to change color, like the way birds left the branches before an earthquake struck. She didn't need to look at those 3 men again to know something had changed at the middle table. That the 3 men drinking beer at 9 o'clock were no longer just 3 men drinking beer. But Jolene still had 45 minutes left in her shift. She needed the tips. She needed this job. She needed the $32 still missing for Penny's therapy session at the end of the month. She drew in a deep breath, took 3 bottles of beer from the refrigerator, set them on a tray, and stepped out from behind the bar, walking straight toward the storm, sitting and waiting for her. Jolene set the 3 bottles of beer down on the table, gathered the 3 empty ones onto her tray, and turned away. She didn't say another word beyond the brief, "Here's your beer," because her night shift instinct was screaming that the less she interacted with this table, the better. But Shane didn't let her leave that easily. "Hey, hey, hey," he called after her, his voice drawn out like a man tugging on a fishing line just to see how hard the fish would struggle. "Where are you running off to, sweetheart? The place is this empty. Sit down and have a drink with us." Jolene didn't turn around. "I'm working, sir. Call me if you need anything else." She walked back to the bar, set the tray down, and began wiping glasses. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but her hands weren't shaking. Not yet. 2 minutes later, Shane called again. "Bartender, 3 more." Jolene looked toward the middle table. The 3 bottles she'd just brought over were still nearly full, the foam not even settled yet. He wasn't thirsty. He wanted her walking back and forth. She took 3 bottles and carried them over. Shane looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately, the kind of look he wanted her to know he was giving. "Come back this way. I want to watch you walk again," he said, and Dwight laughed along with him, a thick chuckle trapped low in his throat. Jolene set the beer down, collected the empties, and turned away without saying anything. She didn't laugh with him. She didn't answer back. She didn't give him any reaction at all. That was how she'd handled hundreds of drunk men over all her years working night shifts, turning herself into a wall, smooth, cold, with nothing for them to grab onto, and most of them would eventually get bored and give up. But Shane Pryor wasn't most men. He called her a 3rd time. This time it wasn't for beer. "Let me see the menu, sweetheart. But you've got to stand here and read it to me. My eyes are bad." His eyes weren't bad. Jolene knew it. He knew she knew it, and he liked that. "The menu's on the bar. You can grab one any time," Jolene replied, her voice flat. "You got a phone number?" Shane asked, leaning toward her with his elbow on the table. "So I can call you next time instead of having to yell like this. Do you need anything else?" Jolene repeated the only question she allowed herself to ask, her voice still polite but sharp as the edge of a folding knife. Then she turned away, and she saw it in Shane's eyes as she turned her back, just a flicker, less than a second, reflected in the old mirror behind the liquor shelf. Anger. Not explosive anger, but the slow-burning anger of a man used to being indulged, used to being feared, used to being obeyed, who had suddenly run into a woman who gave him none of those things, a bruised ego. Of all the catalysts in the world, that was the most dangerous kind, because it turned cowards into reckless men, and turned drunkenness into cruelty. Shane called Jolene back a 4th time. This time he didn't use his mouth. He picked up the beer bottle on the table, tilted his hand, and poured it straight onto the wooden floor. Beer spread into a puddle, running beneath the table and soaking into the cracks between the boards. "Oh," Shane said, his voice pretending surprise like a bad actor reading a line. "Spilled it. Wipe it up." Jolene stood behind the bar, looked at the puddle of beer on the floor, then looked at Shane. 2 seconds. She clenched her teeth hard enough to feel the muscle in her jaw tighten, hard enough to swallow every word she wanted to say, then picked up the bar towel, walked out, knelt down, and wiped it up, because she needed this job, because of $32, because of Penny. When Jolene stood, her back had just straightened when she felt it, a hand settling on her waist from behind, not brushing her, settling there, 5 fingers spread wide, gripping tight, holding her in place, as if she were an object that belonged to him. Shane. Jolene didn't inhale sharply. She didn't scream. She turned around, and with one decisive motion, she knocked his hand off her waist. Hard, clear, impossible to misunderstand. "Don't touch me." Jolene's voice didn't shake. It was sharp, low, and solid, the voice of a woman who had endured things far worse than a hand on her waist and had still remained standing. She looked straight into Shane's pale gray eyes, and in that moment, he saw the thing he hated most in the world in a woman, the absence of fear. The slap came so fast Jolene didn't see his hand rise. She only felt it, the left side of her face flaring as if someone had pressed a hot iron against her cheek, her left ear filling with a heavy ringing, the world tilting 45 degrees. She staggered sideways, her foot slipping on the puddle of beer she'd just wiped but hadn't dried, and she almost fell. but her hand caught the back of the nearest chair, and Jolene Caldwell didn't fall. She found her balance, planted both feet back on the floor, and straightened her spine. Her left cheek burned raw, her ear still rang, and her eyes blurred for 1 second from the body's reflex. But she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't step back. She stood there, looking at Shane with the amber brown eyes her late husband had once said were the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen, and there was no fear in those eyes. There was pain. There was anger. But there was no fear. Dwight burst out laughing, a wet, ugly laugh, like someone draining the last dirty water from a filthy sink. He slapped his thigh and shook his head, as if he'd just watched the funniest moment on late-night television. But at the end of the table, Cody Feltz didn't laugh. He looked down at the tabletop, both hands wrapped tightly around his beer bottle, his foot tapping over and over against the wooden floor, faster than before, the sign of a man who wanted to stand up and walk out the door but didn't dare, because Shane Pryor was the kind of man you didn't get to leave until he allowed it. The amber glass fell silent again, with only the steady jazz from the old speaker in the corner, the sound of old Bert scrubbing pots in the kitchen, and the soft patter of snow against the window outside. Jolene stood in the middle of the bar, one hand still gripping the back of the chair, her left cheek blazing red, and she knew, as clearly as she knew her own name, that tonight wouldn't end with this slap. In the kitchen, Bert Hennessy stood beside the sink, both hands buried in soapy water, scrubbing the old black cast-iron pot he'd used through 12 years of working at the amber glass. He heard Shane's voice growing louder through the kitchen door, left slightly open, heard the filthy comments he tried to pretend he didn't hear, heard the beer bottle pour out onto the floor, heard Jolene say, "Don't touch me," in a cold, sharp voice he'd never once heard her use in all the time she'd worked there. Then he heard the slap. That sound wasn't like any other sound in the world. It wasn't like a hand striking a table, wasn't like a slap on the shoulder, wasn't like anything harmless. It was sharp, dry, and carried the kind of weight that only flesh hitting flesh, with the intention to hurt, could create. Bert had lived 64 years in this world. He'd heard that sound on the battlefield in the Gulf War, in shabby bars on the outskirts of town, in the house of his childhood when his father drank too much and his mother didn't speak quickly enough. 64 years, and he still recognized it instantly, still hated it with every cell in his aging body. He looked down at his hands, the fingers swollen from arthritis, the knuckles aching every time the weather turned cold, and he knew those hands couldn't punch anyone anymore. But Bert Hennessy wasn't the kind of man who stood in a kitchen wiping pots, while a girl he thought of as his own daughter was being hit out there. He reached up to the knife rack hanging on the wall, pulled down the meat cleaver, its steel blade longer than a handspan, heavy, flashing beneath the fluorescent light. Then he pushed the kitchen door open with his shoulder and stepped outside. The amber glass opened before him like a dark box, dim yellow Edison bulbs glowing overhead. Jolene standing beside the middle table with her left cheek blazing red, and 3 men looking at her the way animals looked at prey that had already run itself empty. Bert stood in the aisle, right in the space between the middle table and the bar, the meat cleaver in his right hand, the tip of the blade pointing toward the floor. He stood facing Dwight, the biggest one, the one sitting closest to the aisle, the one with cloudy eyes like dirty glass and 2 tattooed arms resting on the tabletop. Bert knew what he looked like right then. 64 years old, thinning gray hair damp with sweat, a white apron stained with grease and dishwater, arthritic knees bent slightly, keeping him from standing completely straight. He didn't look like a hero. He looked exactly like what he was, a tired old man holding a kitchen knife, but he stood firm. 10 seconds. Dwight looked at him, then at the knife, then back at him. Shane leaned back in his chair, narrowed his eyes, and let out a soft whistle, as if the old man had just done something amusing. Cody pulled his legs up onto the chair, his hand moving toward the back of his waistband again. Bert stood there for 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds were the longest 10 seconds of his life. Longer than any 10 seconds in the Gulf Desert, longer than the 10 seconds he'd spent waiting for his wife's biopsy results 20 years earlier, longer than all of it. "I'm old," Bert said, his voice hoarse but not shaking. "I'm not afraid to die, but if you touch that girl, you'll have to kill me first." Dwight looked at him for 2 more seconds. Then he stood up. He rose slowly, his thick belly pushing the edge of the table with a creak against the wooden floor, and when he straightened to his full height, he was nearly a head taller than Bert, and at least 40 kilograms heavier. He moved toward Bert, each step heavy, as if someone were driving a stake into the ground. Bert didn't move back. He raised the knife, not pointing it at Dwight, only holding it between himself and the man as a final warning. Dwight didn't stop. He reached out, grabbed Bert's right wrist, his hand so large that his thumb and forefinger closed around the old man's wrist with room to spare, and squeezed. Arthritis. 64 years old with arthritis. The finger joints Bert had to soak in warm water for 10 minutes every morning before he could move them. The finger joints that needed pain pills 3 times a day just so he could grip a pot handle. Those joints were now being crushed by a 29-year-old hand. Bert couldn't hold on. His fingers sprang open, one by one, like wilted petals dropping from a stem. The knife fell. Dwight snatched it from his hand as easily as taking a toy from a child. Then Dwight shoved Bert. Not a punch, not a kick, just a shove, one palm driving into his chest. But at 64, with arthritic knees and an unsteady center of gravity, that shove was enough to send Bert falling backward, his back slamming into the stainless steel refrigerator door in the kitchen before he slid down onto the cold tile floor. The kitchen door swung shut behind Dwight as he turned back out, the meat cleaver thrown onto the bar beside the pile of dirty glasses, and Bert lay on the kitchen floor alone. His back hurt, his knees hurt, but what hurt most was that he lay there, looking through the narrow gap beneath the kitchen door, and saw Jolene's old sneakers, worn thin with peeling soles, still standing out there in the bar, among 3 men, and he couldn't do anything. "I'm sorry, Jolene," Bert whispered, his voice breaking like a cracked glass finally surrendering to gravity, his eyes filled with tears. 64 years old, a Gulf War veteran, and he was crying on the kitchen floor of a bar because he couldn't protect the girl he thought of as his child. Then he remembered. The card, the small white card with no name, no title, only a phone number printed in black ink, the one Barrett Mancini had placed on the bar months earlier, the one Bert had tucked into his apron pocket because he didn't know where else to put it. And then it had stayed there, through dozens of apron washings, hundreds of shifts, resting in the little pocket beside a ballpoint pen and his recipe notebook. Bert reached into his apron pocket, pulled out his personal phone. Its screen cracked in a diagonal line from the time he'd dropped it on the kitchen floor last month. His hands were shaking badly. He had to swipe the lock screen twice because his sweat-damp fingers slipped across the glass. He found Barrett's number in his contacts, the number he'd saved under the name Mr. M because he didn't know how to spell Barrett's name correctly. He pressed call. 2 rings. Then the line picked up, and Barrett Mancini's voice came through from the other end. Low, solid. The kind of voice you heard and knew right away that this man had never panicked in his life. "Who is this?" Bert opened his mouth. He wanted to explain, wanted to give every detail, wanted to say there were 3 men. One of them had a knife. Jolene had been slapped. The bar was empty. Denise was hiding in the office. The police wouldn't get there in time. But all that came out of his mouth was one sentence, broken and trembling, the voice of an old man lying on a cold kitchen floor with his heart breaking. "They won't let her go, Mr. Mancini." Silence for 2 seconds on the other end of the line. 2 seconds that felt to Bert as long as an entire lifetime. Then Barrett's voice came, without asking a single additional question, without asking how many men, without asking whether they had weapons, without asking anything a normal person would ask. 15 minutes. Someone will knock on the back kitchen door. 3 knocks. Let them in. Then he hung up. Bert lay on the kitchen floor, holding the cracked screen phone against his chest, staring up at the dirty white ceiling with its spreading water stains, listening to the jazz slipping through the closed kitchen door, listening to Shane's voice drifting faintly from the bar, and he waited. 15 minutes. He only had to wait 15 minutes. Out in the bar, Shane Pryor had taken complete control of the situation, and he knew it. He knew it the way cheap little predators always knew, by instinct rather than intelligence, that the moment the old man with the knife was shoved down into the kitchen was the moment the balance of power in this small bar tilted fully toward him. He rose from his chair, drained the last mouthful of beer from the bottle, set the empty bottle on the table with unusual gentleness, then walked toward the front door. He passed Jolene without looking at her, as if she had become part of the furniture, some object he would come back to deal with after he finished arranging the stage. Jolene stood beside the bar, her left cheek still burning, watching Shane walk to the heavy glass door at the front of the place. He didn't open it. He reached up above it, where the old steel bolt lock was mounted into the wooden frame, the kind of bolt lock the owner had installed back in the 90s to stop nighttime break-ins. Shane slid the bolt to the right. The sound of metal slipping into the lock rang out dry and sharp through the empty bar, like someone chambering around. Then he found the switch on the wall beside the door and flipped it. Outside, the weak amber neon sign that read, "The Amber Lass," blinked one final time before going completely dark. The sign blinked one final time, the letter A flaring bright before going dark. Then the M went out after it, and then everything went black. From outside, seen from the sloping street beside the harbor, the amber glass now looked like any other shop closed in the middle of a winter night, dark, lifeless, with no sign of activity, no reason for any passerby to stop and look inside. Shane turned back, and for the first time since he had walked into the bar that night, he looked straight at Jolene with eyes that were completely sober. That was what chilled Jolene's spine more than the slap. He wasn't drunk enough to lose control. He was sober enough to know exactly what he was doing. Sober enough to lock the door, turn off the sign, and move step by calculated step. The alcohol was only an excuse, a mask he wore so later he could say, "I was too drunk. I don't remember anything." Inside the bar now, there was only the dim yellow glow of the Edison bulbs, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, pulling everything into a half-dark, half-lit kind of light that made people's faces look more twisted, more frightening, and lonelier. Jolene stood beside the bar, her back nearly touching the oak edge, her eyes moving quickly around the room by reflex. Front door, bolted. Kitchen door, blocked by Dwight, who stood with his back against the frame, both tattooed arms folded across his chest. Bert's meat cleaver lying on the bar an arm's length away from him. Bert had disappeared into the kitchen, with no sound coming from inside, and Jolene didn't know whether he was lying on the cold tile floor or trying to find a way out. Denise was still in the back office, silent as death, the door shut tight. Jolene had given up hope on Denise a long time ago. Jolene's right hand slowly moved down to the pocket of her apron, where her personal phone lay mixed in with her order pad and a ballpoint pen. She pulled the phone out, hiding it beneath the edge of the bar, where the darkness covered it. Her finger slid across the screen, unlocked it, pressed 9, pressed 1, pressed 1. The call rang. Once. Jolene held her breath. Then Cody's shadow appeared beside her. He moved faster than she had expected, almost absurdly fast for a man who looked so jittery and clumsy. Cody's bony hand snatched the phone, ripping it from Jolene's hand with a force that made her stumble forward. Then he threw it. The phone flew across the bar, slammed into the red brick wall behind the VIP room, and shattered. The screen split away from the body, glass scattering into small shining pieces that fell onto the wooden floor like crystal rain. The body of the phone bounced back, dropped to the floor, spun twice, then lay still, the screen flashing one final time before going dark. The ringing on the other end of the line stopped halfway through. Jolene looked at the broken pieces of her phone on the floor. 911. She had been that close. One ring. With 2 more seconds, the dispatcher would have answered. With 5 more seconds, she could have said the address. With 10 more seconds, someone somewhere in this city would have known that a 28-year-old woman needed help inside a small bar beside the harbor. But she didn't have 2 more seconds. She had nothing. Then Cody lifted the side of his faded denim jacket, and Jolene finally understood the movement she had seen all night, that unconscious motion of his hand moving back to adjust his waistband, the one she had noticed since 9 o'clock but hadn't named yet. Now she could name it. The gun. A cheap 9mm, scratched metal frame, black plastic grip, tucked into the back of his waistband. Cody pulled it out, not aiming it directly at Jolene but not hiding it either, only holding it at his side. His index finger stretched straight along the body of the gun, the muzzle pointed toward the floor. "Next time," Cody said, and his voice shook, truly shook, with the tremor of a 24-year-old trying to seem more dangerous than his nature allowed. "The bullet will be faster than your finger." Jolene looked at Cody. She looked at his sunken eyes with the dark circles beneath them, looked at the shaking hand holding the gun, looked at his clenched jaw, and realized something strange. Cody Feltz was afraid. Not afraid of her. Afraid of himself. Afraid of Shane. Afraid of the gun in his hand. Afraid that everything had gone too far and he didn't know how to turn back. But realizing the man threatening her was afraid too didn't make Jolene less frightened. It made her more frightened, because nothing was more dangerous than a gun in the hand of someone who was panicking. Jolene drew in a deep breath. She looked one last time at the broken phone on the floor, her final option lying there in useless shards of glass, then lifted her head. She didn't collapse. Her eyes moved around the bar once more, slowly this time, with purpose, the sweep of someone building a map in her mind. The liquor shelf behind the bar, rows of thick glass bottles lined up in order, Macallan, bourbon, vodka, each bottle a possible weapon if she could get close enough. The distance from where she stood to the kitchen door, about 7 meters, with Dwight blocking the middle. Shane was on her left, near the locked front door, leaning against the snow-covered glass wall. Cody was on her right, near the bar, the gun still in his hand, 3 points forming a triangle around her, with no opening wide enough to run through without being stopped. But Jolene was still looking, because Jolene Caldwell was the kind of woman who, when every door closed, didn't sit down and cry. She started looking for a window. Jolene waited. She stood beside the bar, her back nearly touching the edge of the oak, her eyes never leaving the 3 men. But her body had already begun calculating in its own way, the way people trapped in a corner calculate, not through logic, but through the most primitive instinct to survive. Shane had his back turned to her. He was saying something to Dwight in a low voice, his head tilted toward the big man, one hand gesturing toward the kitchen door, and then toward the bar, as if he were dividing up territory, arranging positions. He wasn't looking at Jolene, and that was the only opening she had. Jolene's right hand reached behind her, feeling along the surface of the bar until her fingers touched the thing she had already chosen. The neck of the bourbon bottle sitting closest to the edge of the counter, the bottle she had poured from for the last customer before the bar emptied and hadn't yet put back on the shelf. She gripped the neck of the bottle, her palm tightening around the cold glass, and stepped forward, not running, walking, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps. Shane still had his back turned. Jolene lifted the bottle and brought it down on Shane's right shoulder with every ounce of force. A 28-year-old woman working 2 jobs could summon from her right arm. The bottle didn't break. Bourbon came in thick, heavy glass, and it bounced off Shane's shoulder with a dull clunk, then dropped to the floor and rolled away without cracking. But the blow was strong enough to make Shane stagger forward, his right shoulder numb and aching. He turned around, and on his face, there was no more smugness, no more superior smile, no more lazy predator's gaze. There was only anger, pure, undiluted anger, the kind of anger that came when prey bit back and a man's ego couldn't accept it. Shane shoved Jolene, not another slap, a shove with both hands against her shoulders, hard, violent, the kind of shove that carried the weight of his whole body behind it. Jolene flew backward, her hips striking the edge of the nearest table. Then she lost her balance and fell onto the wooden floor. As she fell, her face hit the edge of the table, and her lower lip split at the thinnest place in the skin, blood seeping out, the sharp metallic taste spreading across her tongue. Jolene lay on the wooden floor of the amber glass, blood in her mouth, pain shooting through her hip, her ear still faintly ringing from the earlier slap, and she looked up. Shane stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes bloodshot, both hands clenched into fists at his sides. Dwight stood behind him, laughing, still that same wet, ugly laugh. Cody stood beside them, the gun in his hand, his face white, not laughing, not speaking. Jolene looked up at Shane from the floor. Blood ran from her lower lip down to her chin, one drop falling onto the collar of her black shirt. And in the amber-brown eyes looking up at the man standing over her, there was no fear. There was pain. There was anger. There was exhaustion. But there was no surrender. "I'm not going to make it easy," Jolene said, her voice low, clear, every word separated as if she were reading Shane his own sentence. And in that moment, something flashed in Shane's eyes. Something between surprise and rage. Because in his small, rotten world, where he was used to making people afraid, used to seeing people tremble, used to seeing people break, a woman lying on the floor with blood on her mouth and still looking him straight in the eye, telling him she wouldn't give in, was something he didn't know how to handle. He bent down, grabbed Jolene's arm, yanked her to her feet with one brutal pull, then shoved her into the nearest chair. "Sit still," he growled through clenched teeth. "Don't move. Don't open your mouth." Jolene sat on the chair, her back straight, both hands resting on her thighs. Blood still seeped slowly from her lip, and she licked it away with the tip of her tongue because there was no towel. Her eyes looked straight ahead, not at Shane, not at anyone, but at the empty space in the middle of the bar, where the Edison lights threw long shadows across the wooden floor. Around her, the 3 men had changed positions. Cody left his old spot and moved toward the kitchen door. blocking the only path that led to Bert. Dwight stepped out of the aisle and shifted toward the bar, his back leaning against the oak edge, both arms folded over his chest. Shane stood directly in front of Jolene, an arm's length away, his eyes still bloodshot, his alcohol-heavy breath coming out in each heavy rise and fall. Every exit had been cut off. The front door was bolted. The kitchen door had Cody. The bar had Dwight. And in front of her was Shane. Jolene sat on the chair, and her right hand slowly rose to her chest, to where the tarnished silver chain lay beneath her shirt. Her fingers found the wedding ring threaded through the chain, small, round, cold, and she gripped it tightly in her palm. She thought of Penny, not of danger, not of the bullet in Cody's gun or Shane's fists. She thought of her daughter's tiny voice, the voice that hundreds of speech therapy sessions, hundreds of nights Jolene had stayed awake, mixing cocktails to pay for those sessions, had helped Penny find again. The voice that had called her mom last week, clear, rounded, 2 short syllables Jolene had waited 3 years to hear. She thought of the therapy session tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, of the way Penny held her hand walking down the hallway, of Captain the teddy bear tucked under her arm, of the way the little girl looked up with eyes so much like her mother's. Penny needed her. She had to go home. Jolene lowered her head, her lips almost touching the fist holding the ring, and she whispered, just loudly enough for herself to hear, softer than the jazz playing through the room, softer than the snow tapping against the window, softer even than the beat of her own heart. Keith, I'm sorry. Not sorry because she was weak. Not sorry because she was about to give up. Sorry because she had already tried her very best. Had driven 2 men away from the bar with a look. Had knocked a hand off her waist. Had stayed standing after the slap. Had called 911. Had struck the man's shoulder with a liquor bottle. Had looked him straight in the eye from the floor and told him she wouldn't surrender. She had done everything. Everything. Everything one woman alone could do. And it still wasn't enough. The most desperate moment in the world wasn't when you gave up. It was when you had fought with everything you had and still lost. Jolene sat on the wooden chair inside the locked bar in the middle of a Boston winter night, dried blood on her lip, her wedding ring clenched in her hand, and she waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. She didn't know that on the kitchen floor behind the closed door, a 64-year-old man was waiting too, holding a cracked screen phone against his chest, counting every minute. And she didn't know that 12 minutes away by car, in the North End, a man with dark gray eyes had just risen from the middle of a dinner table, said not one word to anyone, stepped outside into the snow, and climbed into the back seat of a black SUV already idling and waiting. Then the lights went out. No warning signal. No engine roaring outside on the street. No headlights sweeping across the snow-covered window. No footsteps. No knocking. Nothing at all. There was only one moment when the amber glass existed in the dim yellow glow of the Edison bulbs, and in the next moment, everything vanished. Every light went out at once, as if someone had just cut the cord connecting this room to the rest of the world. Darkness crashed down. Complete. Absolute. So dense that Jolene couldn't see the hand holding the ring against her chest. The kind of darkness you didn't only see with your eyes, but felt on your skin. It had weight. It pressed down on your shoulders, your chest, your eyelids, as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened into something black and cold and liquid. 3 seconds. 3 seconds of absolute silence. The jazz from the old speaker died. The refrigerator in the kitchen stopped humming. The faint electrical buzz, that background sound you never realized existed until it disappeared, went silent too. There was only the wind from Boston Harbor hissing outside the glass door, and the soft strike of snow against the brick wall, and the breathing of 6 human beings locked together inside a black box. Shane cursed. His voice rang out from somewhere to Jolene's left, sharp, panicked, out of control. What the hell? Where are the lights? He turned, or at least Jolene heard his boots scraping against the wooden floor, the soles grinding as he spun in the dark, trying to find his bearings. Cody panicked. Jolene heard his breathing, shallow, fast, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone standing on the edge of a panic attack. And she heard his hands fumbling over his clothes, searching for the gun in his waistband, but in that absolute darkness, with shaking hands and all sense of direction gone, he didn't know where the muzzle was pointing. Dwight made no sound at all. The big man stood frozen in the same spot, some primitive animal instinct waking inside him and telling him what reason hadn't had time to process, that when you couldn't see anything and didn't understand what was happening, the only thing keeping you alive was not moving. Jolene sat on the chair, both hands gripping the edge of the table, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. 3 seconds in the dark, and she didn't know that during those 3 seconds, outside the red brick wall of the amber glass, Tomas Ricci was standing beside the main electrical box, his hand having just pulled the breaker down, listening, counting. 1, 2, 3. She didn't know that at the kitchen's back door, Bert Hennessy had opened it after 3 knocks exactly as Barrett had told him, and Tomas had slipped past the old man in the dark, his footsteps making no sound on the kitchen tile as he walked straight toward the bar. She didn't know that at the front door, Barrett Mancini, in those same 3 seconds of darkness, had used a small crowbar taken from the trunk of the car to snap the old steel bolt Shane had slid into place, the sound of breaking metal swallowed by the chaos inside, and the heavy glass door had opened without a sound. She didn't know any of that. She only knew that 3 seconds passed. Then the lights came back on. All the Edison bulbs lit at once, dim gold flooding the bar again, and Jolene's world changed completely. Nico Valentini stood in the middle of the bar, 3 meters from Shane, 4 meters from Jolene, as if he had appeared out of nowhere, as if he had been born from the darkness and left behind by the light. A black suit, not one wrinkle, a silver watch on his left wrist glinting beneath the Edison glow, his dark gray eyes sweeping across the room with the absolute calm of a man inspecting his own property. He wasn't panting. He wasn't sweating. He didn't look like someone who had just driven 12 minutes through the snow, broken through a door, and entered a locked bar. He looked as if he had just stepped out of the VIP room after finishing his old-fashioned. He looked like he did every Friday night. He looked as if he belonged here more than anyone else in the room. Barrett Mancini stood at the front door, his shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame, the glass door thrown wide open to the cold night, wind and snow rushing in behind him as if winter itself had entered with him. The steel bolt lay on the floor, broken at the joint, useless. Tomas Ricci stood blocking the kitchen door, exactly where Cody had been standing 3 seconds before, and Cody was now backing away, his spine striking the edge of a table, his eyes wide as he stared at the scarred man who had appeared in the very spot where he'd been, as if Cody had been replaced without anyone warning him. Behind Tomas, through the kitchen door left slightly open, Jolene caught a glimpse of Bert sitting up on the tile floor. 2 more men stood on either side of the bar, their backs against the red brick wall, their hands relaxed at their sides, their eyes open, alert, taking in the whole room. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Their positions spoke for them. 2 final locks, sealing every last gap that remained. Jolene sat on the chair, her hand still clutching the ring against her chest, and looked at Nico. She didn't understand how he was here. It was Tuesday night. He only came on Fridays. She didn't understand how 5 men had just entered a bar locked from the inside, without making a single sound that reached her ears. She didn't understand what those 3 seconds of darkness had been. An accident? A coincidence? Or something arranged by hands that knew how to turn night itself into a weapon? She didn't understand any of it, but she understood one thing. The only exit in the bar had just opened. The front door was open, cold wind and snow blowing in. But that exit wasn't for her. It was for the 3 men standing around her. If they were smart enough to realize it, Nico Valentini stood in the middle of the amber glass, his dark gray eyes resting on Jolene's face for exactly 1 second, long enough to see the dried blood on her lip, the bruise rising on her left cheek, the red swelling on her wrist where Shane had grabbed her and pulled her up, long enough to record it, long enough for the muscle in his jaw to tighten once, then release. Then he turned those eyes toward Shane. He didn't ask a question. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't introduce himself. He only stood there and looked. And Nico Valentini's silence, the silence the whole city had learned to fear, began filling the room like rising water. Shane Pryor blinked under the Edison lights that had just come back on. His pale gray eyes needed nearly 2 seconds to adjust after 3 seconds of darkness. And in those 2 seconds, his cheap, beer-soaked brain tried to process the new information. There was a man standing in the middle of the bar, wearing a black suit. Standing straight, calm. Shane's brain classified him immediately in the way brains like Shane's always classified things: fast, shallow, and wrong. The owner, or some office guy stopping in for a late drink, the kind of desk job bastard who wore a suit all day and came to a bar at night pretending he mattered. Not a threat, not a problem, just a small obstacle to deal with, like the old man with the knife in the kitchen, like the bartender girl who dared to knock his hand away, like everything in Shane Pryor's life. Because if he yelled loudly enough, people backed down. Owner's back, huh? Shane shouted across the bar, his voice ringing through the empty space. Confident, loud, the voice of a man who still thought he controlled the room. Good. Open the safe. Nico Valentini didn't answer. He didn't look at Shane. He didn't acknowledge Shane's existence. He walked, slowly, from the middle of the bar toward the counter, every step even. Neither hurried nor slow, the pace of a man who had never needed to rush in his life, because the world had learned to wait for him, not the other way around. He passed Shane, less than a meter away, and didn't turn his head. He reached the bar, stepped behind it, into the place where Jolene stood every night, and reached up to the liquor shelf, the 18-year Macallan. He took it down. He took a clean glass from the rack above, set it on the counter, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, set the bottle down, picked up the glass, and took a sip, slowly, calmly, as if he were in his own home, as if there weren't 3 thugs standing in the bar, as if there weren't a gun, as if there weren't dried blood on the lips of a woman sitting 4 meters away from him. He drank, and he stayed silent. Silent for 15 seconds. 15 seconds isn't a long time on a clock, but inside the amber glass that night, 15 seconds of Nico Valentini's silence felt as long as a lifetime. It was deliberate silence, structured silence, built and deployed with the precision of a man who had used it as a weapon in thousands of negotiations, hundreds of confrontations, and dozens of moments when ordinary people would have said something only because they couldn't bear the quiet. Ordinary people used silence to think. Nico used silence to make the other side imagine the worst thing on their own. Because what you imagine when you're facing the silence of a powerful man is always more frightening than any threat spoken aloud. Shane began to grow uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being ignored. His whole life, when he yelled, people reacted. They feared him, yelled back, or backed away. But they always reacted. The man in the suit, drinking whiskey behind the bar, gave him no reaction at all, and that angered him more than being challenged would have, because you can't win against an enemy who doesn't bother joining the fight. Are you deaf? Shane took 1 step toward Nico, his voice higher now, sharper, deliberately more aggressive. I said, open the safe. Nico took another sip of Macallan. He didn't look up. Barrett Mancini stood at the front door, not moving. Tomas Ricci stood at the kitchen door, not moving. The 2 other men stood on either side of the bar, not moving. None of them needed to move, because none of them took orders from Shane Pryor. They only took orders from one man, and that man was drinking whiskey. When that man set his glass down, everything would begin. But before Nico set down his glass, Cody Feltz understood. He understood before Shane, before Dwight, before his own reason could process the information. Because although Cody was the youngest, the weakest, and the most afraid of the 3 men, he was also the only one with a real survival instinct. The kind of instinct people developed not through strength, but through the experience of being hunted. Cody was standing closer to the front door than the other 2, and when the lights came back on, he had seen Barrett. He had seen the neck as thick as a utility pole, seen the shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway, seen the stance, low center of gravity, hands relaxed at his sides, knees slightly bent, ready, the kind of stance only 2 kinds of people in the world had: Special Forces soldiers, or the kind of men who did the work Special Forces soldiers didn't want to do. Then Cody's eyes moved, from Barrett to Nico, and he saw the ring. It sat on the ring finger of Nico's right hand, tarnished silver, not the flashy jewelry ring rich men wore to show off, but a family crest ring, heavy, old, passed down from one generation to the next. On the face of the ring, carved deep into the silver, was the symbol of a letter V, enclosed inside a black flame. Cody knew that symbol. He knew it from 2 years in Suffolk County Jail, where the name Valentini was whispered in the cafeteria, in the yard, in the cells, in the same voice people used when whispering the name of something that shouldn't be spoken aloud. He knew that anyone who had ever been inside the Massachusetts prison system knew that symbol. And anyone who knew that symbol knew one unwritten rule: simple, clear, with no exceptions. Never, under any circumstances, in any form, stand across from the man wearing that ring. The blood drained from Cody's face. It wasn't a figure of speech. His face went from normal skin color to deathly white within 2 seconds. as if someone had opened a valve and drained every bit of paint from a wall. His hand shook. His whole body shook. And then Cody Feltz did the smartest thing he had done in all 24 years of his existence. He dropped the 9mm. He didn't set it down. He dropped it, opening his hand and letting the gun fall freely. It struck the wooden floor with a clear clack that rang through the silent bar, then spun half a turn and lay still. Then Cody dropped to his knees. Both knees touched the floor, both hands lifted beside his ears, palms open and facing forward. Not one word. He knelt like a man who already knew that anything he said now would be useless and dangerous, that his only chance of survival was to make himself as small as possible, as silent as possible, and pray that the man wearing that ring decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Shane turned and looked at Cody. His face twisted, half angry and half confused. The expression of a man trying to solve an equation he didn't have enough intelligence to solve. "Cody?" he shouted. "Cody, what the hell are you doing?" Cody stayed on his knees, both hands raised, eyes fixed on the wooden floor, and said 4 words in a voice Jolene would never forget, the voice of a man who had looked into the eyes of death and realized he had nothing to negotiate with. "I want to live, Shane." 4 words. 4 short words, and they exploded through the amber glass louder than any gunshot, because when a man holding a gun, the most volatile one in the group, drops the weapon on his own and kneels without anyone touching him, without anyone threatening him, without anyone saying one word to him, only because he has seen a ring on the finger of a man drinking whiskey, that tells you everything you need to know about that man. It tells you more than any threat, more than any gun, more than any act of violence ever could. It says that this man's reputation is so powerful that being recognized is enough to make someone surrender. Shane looked at Cody kneeling on the floor, then looked toward Nico, and for the first time that night, something other than smugness began to flicker behind his pale gray eyes. Not fear, not yet, but unease, the kind of unease that comes when a man begins to suspect he has misjudged the situation, though his ego still won't allow him to admit it. Nico Valentini set the Macallan glass down on the oak bar, gently, without a sound. Then he turned, and for the first time since stepping into the amber glass, he looked directly at Shane Pryor. Dark gray eyes met pale gray eyes, and the distance between those 2 shades of gray was the distance between an ocean and a puddle of rainwater. Nico opened his mouth, the first words he had spoken that night, and he didn't speak to Shane. He spoke about Cody. "The kid is smarter than you." Those 5 words hung in the air inside the amber glass like cigarette smoke, slowly spreading, seeping into every corner. "The kid's smarter than you." Nico didn't even look at Shane when he said it. He was looking at Cody, kneeling on the floor, and in his voice there was something almost like acknowledgement, not praise, not pity, but the acknowledgement given to someone who knew how to read a situation and act correctly. And that acknowledgement given to Cody was the cruelest takedown of all for Shane, because it meant Nico Valentini judged a trembling underling higher than the leader himself. The man wasn't even worth being spoken to directly. The first sentence Nico spoke that night wasn't meant for him but for a 24-year-old kid on his knees on the floor. Shane hadn't had time to process that humiliation before Dwight broke. Dwight Huxley wasn't the kind of man who knew how to kneel. He didn't have Cody's instinct for analyzing a situation, didn't have the ability to read the family crest ring or recognize Barrett's tactical stance. Dwight's brain had only 2 modes, fight or run. And when fighting wasn't an option, because even Dwight could feel that the air inside the bar had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed, only one mode remained. Run, he bolted. That huge, thick-bellied body suddenly exploded from beside the bar, his boot soles pounding hard across the wooden floor, heading for the kitchen door, the closest exit, the only exit his panicked brain could process. Tomas Ricci was standing in front of the kitchen door. Dwight charged straight at Tomas, and Tomas did something no one in the bar expected. He stepped aside, lightly, neatly, almost politely, like a gentleman making room for someone on the sidewalk on a Sunday morning. He even leaned back slightly, even extended one hand, as if inviting Dwight to pass. Dwight saw the opening and threw himself into it, all his weight driving forward, his momentum impossible to stop. His foot crossed the kitchen threshold. Then Tomas put out his foot. That was all. A small, precise, effortless motion, the tip of his shoe extending just far enough for Dwight's front foot to catch on it and turn the force of his sprint into the force of a fall. Dwight landed face first, his body, weighing more than 100 kilograms, slid across the kitchen floor. Bert's kitchen towel flying off its hook when Dwight's arm swept into it, pots and pans crashing down, and his head slammed into the leg of the cast iron table in the middle of the kitchen with a dull, heavy, solid clunk. Dwight lay on the floor, face down against the cold tile, gasping, both hands clutching his head, unable to stand. Not because he was unconscious, but because every bit of air had been knocked out of his lungs when his belly hit the floor, and he lay there with his mouth open, breathing like a fish thrown onto shore. Tomas looked down at Dwight sprawled on the kitchen floor. The scar stretching across his face twitched slightly beneath the fluorescent light. And for the first time that night, Tomas Ricci opened his mouth. Slippery floor. 2 words, his voice flat, emotionless, like a man reading a warning sign in a grocery store. Then he returned to his old position, blocking the kitchen door, his back straight, his hands relaxed, as if he'd done nothing more than step aside for a customer in a hurry. Across the bar, Barrett Mancini walked over to Cody, who was still kneeling. The youngest man remained in the same position, both knees on the floor, both hands raised beside his ears, eyes lowered, not daring to look up. Barrett bent down and picked up the 9mm lying on the wooden floor half a meter from Cody. He held it with 2 fingers, thumb and forefinger, lifting it lightly as if picking up something dirty he didn't want touching his skin for too long. With one practiced motion, he slid the magazine out of the gun, tucked the magazine into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, then placed the empty gun on the bar beside the Macallan bottle. The entire process took about 4 seconds, and Barrett did it with the calm of a man picking up a newspaper that had fallen on a chair and folding it neatly. Not fast, not slow, no emotion, just a small task that had to be done before moving on with the rest of the evening. Now only Shane remained. Cody was kneeling on the floor. Dwight was lying in the kitchen, and Shane Pryor stood alone, his back against the red brick wall of the bar, his chest rising and falling, his eyes darting between Nico behind the bar, Barrett by the front door, Tomas at the kitchen door, and the 2 other men standing along the walls. 5 men surrounded him from every direction, and every one of them looked more like a wall than a human being, patient, motionless, impossible to pass. Jolene had stepped back toward the bar from the moment the lights came back on. She stood a few steps from Barrett, close to the exit, away from Shane, watching everything unfold with eyes still shocked but beginning to understand that the storm had changed direction, that she was no longer the prey. Shane's hand slipped behind him, searched his back pocket, and pulled out a switchblade. He pressed the button on the handle, and the blade snapped open with a small, sharp click, the steel flashing beneath the Edison lights. He pointed the knife at Nico, his arm stretched straight out, the tip trembling at a distance of about 2 meters. "Back off," Shane shouted, and his voice cracked. It was no longer the commanding roar of a man who slapped women in empty bars. It was no longer the voice of a self-styled alpha. It was the voice of an animal trapped in a corner, an animal that knew it had lost but whose jaws still refused to stop baring teeth, because baring its teeth was the only thing it still knew how to do. Nico Valentini stepped out from behind the bar. He moved around the end of the counter, entered the open space of the room, and walked toward Shane. Not fast, not slow, each step even, firm, his eyes fixed on Shane's eyes, not on the knife. He didn't look at the knife because the knife didn't matter. A knife was the weapon of a desperate man, and a desperate man holding a knife was more dangerous to himself than to the person in front of him. Nico knew that. He'd known it before Shane had even been born. "Do you think you'll be fast enough?" Nico asked, and his voice was soft, almost gentle, almost pitying. The voice of a father asking a child running through the house with scissors whether he understood what was about to happen. The distance between Nico and Shane narrowed. 2 meters. 1.5 meters. With every step Nico took forward, the blade in Shane's hand trembled a little more. The steel flashed, shaking, useless. Shane looked into Nico's dark gray eyes and saw the most frightening thing he had ever seen in his life. Not anger, not hatred, not intimidation. Certainty. Absolute certainty. Cold and unshakable. From a man who knew exactly what would happen next and wasn't in any hurry, because the outcome had already been decided from the moment he stepped through the door, and everything happening between then and now was only procedure. 1 second. The blade was still pointed outward. 2 seconds. Shane's arm began to lower, not because he wanted it to, but because his muscles were betraying him, refusing to keep taking part in a fight the rest of his body already knew was lost. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The knife fell. It slipped from Shane's hand and struck the wooden floor with a small, harmless clatter. The sound of a weapon turning back into what it had always been. A cheap little piece of steel lying on a barroom floor. Shane slid down the red brick wall, slowly, his spine scraping against the rough surface until he sat on the floor, knees drawn up, both hands over his head, face lowered, shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying. Not yet, but something inside him had broken. Something he had spent his whole life building with violence, with aggression, with making people afraid. The hard shell he called manhood. It had just broken beneath the dim yellow Edison lights, in front of a man who didn't need to raise his hand even once. Nico Valentini stood in front of Shane Pryor and looked down. There was nothing hurried in his eyes. No anger, no contempt, only the cold calm of a man deciding, not deciding whether punishment should happen, but deciding what kind of punishment would be worthy of what Shane had done. Shane sat collapsed on the floor, his back against the brick wall, his knees drawn up, both hands clutching his head, his shoulders shaking. He looked smaller than he had at any other moment that night. Smaller than when he had shouted orders. Smaller than when he had slapped Jolene. Smaller than when he had locked the bar door. Beneath the dim yellow Edison lights, without the knife, without the beer bottle, without his pack laughing along, Shane Pryor was only what he had always been, a coward curled up on the floor. Nico bent down. His right hand, the one wearing the tarnished silver family crest ring, slipped into the front right pocket of Shane's pants. Shane flinched and folded in on himself, but he didn't dare resist. Nico pulled out his cell phone, an old smartphone with a cracked screen and scratched plastic casing. The kind of phone that belonged to a man who had nothing but trouble. He straightened, opened the screen, and slid his finger through the contacts. Shane hadn't locked his phone. Men like Shane never locked their phones, because they believed no one would dare touch what belonged to them. Nico scrolled through the names. There weren't many. Shane Pryor's contact list was as short as the life of the relationships he had burned down. Then Nico's finger stopped. Mom. 1 word. 3 letters. Sitting among the thin, miserable contacts of a 31-year-old criminal like the last jewel left in the ruins. Mom. Someone had given birth to Shane Pryor. Someone had held him, fed him, named him, called him son. Someone was still saved in his phone as Mom, instead of her real name. Because even the worst men in the world didn't call their mothers by name. Nico pressed call. Then he pressed speaker. The ringing echoed through the amber glass, through the thick silence no one dared to break. Once, twice, 3 times. Each ring stretched longer, heavier, like a countdown to something Shane knew he couldn't bear. 4 times. Then the line picked up, and a voice spilled into the bar. The voice of an old woman, sleepy, worried. The voice of someone who had just been woken in the middle of the night, and whose first reaction wasn't irritation but fear. Fear for the son she knew was always in trouble. Shane? What time is it? Are you okay? His mother's voice was warm, slightly hoarse from sleep. Worried in the way only a mother could worry. The kind of worry that didn't need a reason, didn't need proof, because the moment the phone rang at midnight, her heart had already tightened. Her voice filled the empty bar, bouncing against the brick wall, touching the ceiling, touching the floor, touching everyone standing in that room. The whole bar stood still. Barrett stood beside the counter, motionless, both hands resting at his sides, eyes straight ahead, expressionless. Tomas stood at the kitchen door, his back straight, arms folded, the scar across his face unmoving under the light. The 2 other men stood along the walls like 2 statues that knew how to breathe. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Jolene stood beside the bar, both hands gripping the edge of the oak counter, and she looked at Shane sitting on the floor, and she looked at the phone in Nico's hand, carrying the voice of an old mother somewhere out there in the night. A mother who didn't know that her son had just slapped a woman, had just locked a door and trapped her inside, had just grabbed her wrist and dragged her like an object. And something in Jolene's chest ached. Not pity for Shane, but pity for the mother. Pity for that worried voice in the middle of the night. Pity for the way she called him son, with all the tenderness Shane didn't deserve to receive. Shane looked at the phone in Nico's hand. Then he looked up into those dark gray eyes, and he understood. He understood what Nico wanted. He didn't want to hit him, didn't want to kick him, didn't want to use Barrett's fists, or Tomas's blade, or the bullet in the magazine that had just been removed. He wanted something more painful than all of those things put together. He wanted Shane to hear his mother's voice, and in that moment, something inside Shane Pryor broke open. Not his ego. His ego had broken when the knife fell. What broke now was deeper, older, buried at the very bottom beneath all the layers that prison and streets and liquor and violence had piled on for years but had never fully managed to bury. What broke open was the memory of the child Shane had once been. The child who called her Mom. The child who hadn't yet learned to slap anyone, hadn't yet learned to lock doors and trap anyone, hadn't yet learned to grab a woman's wrist. He cried. Not the way a man tried to hold it in, gritting his teeth, swallowing tears, keeping his face. He cried like a child caught in the act, tears spilling out beyond his control, nose red, shoulders shaking, mouth twisted, ugly, naked, with nothing left to hide behind. Mom. Shane choked out, his voice breaking into pieces across the bar floor. I'm sorry. His mother heard him crying on the other end of the line, and she panicked, the way mothers always panicked when they heard their child cry, whether that child was 31 years old or 3, because to a mother, her child's cry never had an age. Shane? What happened? Where are you? Are you hurt? Shane, talk to me. What's wrong? Her voice came fast, worried, loving, pouring into the amber glass like warm water spilling into a room full of ice. And everyone in the bar heard it, all of them silent, all of them bearing the weight of that voice, because that voice reminded everyone that the man crying on the floor had once been a child someone loved, and that didn't forgive what he had done. But it made everything more complicated, more painful, more real. Nico reached out and took the phone back. He ended the call. The mother's voice cut off midway through her final question, and silence returned to the bar, heavier than before, thicker than before, the silence of a courtroom after a sentence had just been read. Nico looked down at Shane. His voice was low, slow, each word clear, each word set down like a brick in a wall Shane would never climb over. She'll never know what her son did tonight, but you'll remember. Every time you look at her face, you'll remember. Every time she calls you, you'll remember. Every time she says, "Are you okay?" You'll remember that the woman you slapped tonight also has a child waiting for her to come home. Silence. The amber glass was so quiet that Jolene could hear the snow falling outside the window, hear the harbor wind blowing through the front door standing wide open, hear Dwight gasping in the kitchen, hear Shane crying on the floor. That judging silence was heavier than any punch Barrett Mancini could have thrown with his enormous hands, heavier than any blade Tomas Ricci could have drawn from inside his suit jacket, heavier than any bullet in the magazine sitting inside Barrett's pocket. It pressed down on Shane Pryor like a gravestone, and he sat beneath that weight, crying on the wooden floor of the bar, under the dim yellow Edison lights, and he knew Nico Valentini was right. He would remember, not because he wanted to remember, but because his mother's voice saying, "Are you okay?" at midnight would never stop echoing in his head, and every time it echoed, he would see Jolene Caldwell's face with dried blood on her lip and a bruise on her cheek, and he would know there was no prison on earth that could cage him more tightly than the prison Nico had just built for him with one phone call. Nico tossed the phone into Shane's lap. It struck his thigh, bounced once, then lay still on the wooden floor beside the switchblade that had fallen earlier. The two weapons Shane had used that night, one made of steel and one made of cowardice, now lay side by side on the floor, as useless as the man who owned them. Nico turned his back on Shane, walked toward the bar, and when he spoke, his voice was no louder than ordinary conversation, but every word rang clearly through the empty bar, as if it had been carved into the air. Stand up, all 3 of you. You have 6 hours to leave my land. If after 6 hours I hear that any one of you is still in Massachusetts, the next meeting won't be as polite as tonight. He didn't turn around when he said it. He didn't need to. Shane stayed on the floor for 3 more seconds, as if his body needed time to receive orders from a mind that had been psychologically crushed. Then he braced one hand against the wall and stood on trembling legs, stumbling toward the kitchen, where Dwight was still lying on the floor. He bent down, grabbed Dwight by the arm, and pulled the big man up. Dwight staggered, one hand holding the spot on his head where it had hit the table leg, his eyes dull, but he could stand. Cody had been standing for a while already, both hands still raised to shoulder height even though no one was making him hold that pose anymore. His survival instinct still running at its highest setting, and he didn't dare lower his hands until he was certain he was allowed to. None of the 3 men said another word. They didn't look at Jolene, didn't look at Nico, didn't look at Barrett or Tomas. They walked out the front door with their heads down, shoulders hunched, the posture of men who had just been spared and knew it. Tomas and the two other men followed, escorting the three out to the parking lot behind the bar. Through the open door, Jolene heard the engine of an old car turn over, heard tires grind against snow, then heard the car pull away, heard Tomas's car follow, and finally, silence. Only wind and snow remained. Barrett Mancini went out the front door, not to follow the three men, but to reach the black SUV parked close to the curb. He opened the trunk and came back with a square dark green canvas bag, the kind of standard military first aid bag with the letters USMC embroidered in one faded corner, neatly packed inside with sterile gauze, medical tape, antiseptic, small scissors, forceps, and a tube of antibiotic ointment. He sat down on the bar stool beside Jolene, set the first aid bag on the counter, opened it, and without asking whether Jolene agreed, gently took her right wrist and turned it to examine the bruising where Shane had grabbed her and pulled her to her feet. Barrett's hands were almost as large as Jolene's face. Hands that had done many things. Things that, if Jolene knew them, she wouldn't want to know. Things courts called by very heavy names. But now, beneath the dim yellow Edison lights, those enormous hands became strangely gentle. Barrett cleaned the scrape on Jolene's wrist with an alcohol-soaked gauze pad, his movements precise, quick, decisive, without causing more pain. Then he took a small cotton pad, dabbed on ointment, gently wiped the dried blood from her lower lip, and examined the split. "Wrist is scraped, not broken," Barrett said, his voice low and calm, as if reading out a medical result. "Lips swollen, but it doesn't need stitches. Ointment for 3 days, and it'll close." He placed a small bandage over her wrist, cut the medical tape with scissors, and pressed the edges down gently so they would hold. "I used to bandage wounds in Fallujah," he added, as if he needed to explain why his hands knew how to do this. "This is light." Jolene looked at his hands as he finished taping the last bandage on her wrist, then looked up. "You served too?" Barrett nodded once, briefly. "Different uniform." Those 2 words held more than they appeared to. They held the story of a former Marine who had gone from the deserts of the Middle East to Boston Harbor, who had traded a military uniform for a black suit, who had traded the orders of the Department of Defense for the orders of Nico Valentini, and through that entire journey, his hands had still done the same thing, protected the person beside him. Nico stood at the end of the bar, his Macallan glass empty, his dark gray eyes resting on Jolene for 1 more second. Then he nodded to Barrett, put on his coat, and stepped out the door into the snowy night. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" or say, "I'm sorry this happened." He simply left, because Nico Valentini wasn't the kind of man who said those things. He was the kind of man who did those things, then disappeared. But before he left, before his shadow vanished beyond the door, Jolene saw him stop for 1 second in the parking lot where her car was parked, gesturing to one of his men, before climbing into the back seat of the black SUV. The office door at the back of the bar flew open. Denise Whitmore poked her head out, her eyes darting quickly across the bar like a rat checking the room before leaving its hole, judging whether the situation was safe now. No more shouting, no more men in suits, only Jolene sitting at the bar and Barrett packing up the first aid bag. She stepped fully into the room, fixed her hair, tugged her shirt straight, and rushed toward Jolene with the fake hurried steps of someone trying to play concerned after hiding through the entire performance. "Oh my God, Jolene, are you okay?" I tried to call. Denise didn't finish the sentence. The front door opened, and Thomas Ricci stepped inside, a thin layer of snow dusting the shoulders of his suit jacket, just returned after escorting the 3 men to the city limits. He walked straight to Denise, not fast, not slow. He stopped 1 step away from her and looked. Only looked. The scar running from the left corner of his mouth, almost to his ear, twitched slightly beneath the light, creating the illusion that he was smiling, but there wasn't a trace of humor in his black eyes. Denise froze, the words I tried to call dying in her throat. "You'll pay Jolene her full wages for this week in cash," Tomas said, and it was the longest sentence he spoke that night, longer than slippery floor, longer than anything he had said since entering the bar, and every word fell from his mouth like a stone. "Right now, and you'll give her paid leave until she's fully healed." Denise opened the safe. Her hands shook so badly that she had to enter the code twice. She counted the money and placed it on the bar in front of Jolene, not daring to look into Jolene's eyes, not daring to look into Tomas's eyes, not daring to look at anything except the cash and the oak counter. Then she backed away, returned to the office, and closed the door again. No one stopped her. No one needed her. The kitchen door opened. Bert Hennessy stepped out slowly, his arthritic knees making him limp a little, his white apron crooked, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes red as if he had been crying for a long time in a dark room. He didn't look at Barrett, didn't look at Tomas, didn't look at the bar. He looked only at Jolene. Then he walked straight to her, his old kitchen shoes dragging across the wooden floor, and he hugged her, without saying a word. Two aging arms, the arms of a 64-year-old cook, the arms of a Gulf War veteran, the arms of an old man with arthritis who hadn't been able to keep hold of a meat cleaver, wrapped around Jolene Caldwell as she sat on the bar stool, and he cried. He cried not because of pain, not because of fear, but because he had lain on the kitchen floor, looking through the crack beneath the door and seeing her old shoes still standing out there alone among three men, and he hadn't been able to do anything, and that helplessness would follow him for the rest of his life. Jolene lifted both arms and hugged the old man back. She rested her chin on his shoulder, breathing in the smell of cooking oil and butter still clinging to his apron. And she spoke softly, her voice tired but without blame. Not 1 second of blame. "Bert, you were there. You didn't walk away. That means more than you think." Bert cried on her shoulder, and Jolene held him like that, inside the amber glass, now empty except for them. Barrett standing quietly beside the bar as he folded the first aid bag closed, Tomas standing by the door looking out into the snowy night, and the jazz from the old speaker in the corner, still playing the same song that no one had turned back on after the lights returned, because it had never stopped. It had kept playing through the whole night, through the darkness, through the shouting, through all of it, as if it were the only thing in that bar that never gave up. The next morning, around 10 o'clock, when the winter sunlight of Boston slanted through the thin layer of snow, still clinging to the window and the neon sign of the amber glass, dark in broad daylight, looked like the dried spine of a fish mounted on the brick wall. The front door of the bar opened, and Detective Raymond Goss walked in. He was the kind of man you looked at once and immediately knew what he did for a living. Not because he wore a badge or had handcuffs showing openly on his belt, but because his face was a map of 22 years spent looking at things ordinary people were allowed to turn away from. Salt and pepper hair cut short, a high forehead crossed by deep horizontal lines, the permanent black shadows beneath the eyes of a man who had been sleep-deprived for years, and a jaw that was always chewing mint gum, slowly, evenly, as if he needed to keep his mouth busy so his head wouldn't think too much. Goss hadn't come because of any 911 call. There had been no 911 call last night, at least not one that had connected. One ring and then silence wasn't enough for the system to register. He had come because of street sources, the kind of sources every Boston Harbor cop had, eyes and ears tucked inside coffee shops, laundromats, warehouses, whispering to him that something had happened last night at the little bar beside the docks, that there had been shouting, strange cars, and a black convoy belonging to the man the whole neighborhood didn't dare name. Jolene was standing behind the bar, wiping the oak surface with a damp cloth, her left hand moving in the familiar circles she had repeated thousands of times during her 8 months working there. Her right wrist was wrapped in clean white bandages, neat and careful, the kind of bandage done by someone who knew what he was doing. Her lower lip was slightly swollen, but she had covered it with a thin layer of lipstick, not to look pretty, but so no one would ask. Goss pushed the door open and stepped inside, looking around the bar with eyes that 22 years on the job had trained into a scanner. He didn't search by turning his head or walking all over the room. He simply stood at the door for 3 seconds and let his eyes work. 3 seconds was enough. He saw the long scrape across the wooden floor near the kitchen door, fresh, brighter than the wood around it, the kind of mark a heavy object made when it slid across the floor with speed and force it hadn't chosen. He saw the front door bolt, the steel bolt lock mounted on the wooden frame, bent and warped at the joint. One end still caught in the lock while the steel bar was folded in the middle, the kind of damage bare hands didn't cause. He saw the tiny shards of glass glittering in the trash can beside the bar, glass shaped like pieces of a phone screen, mixed in with bottle caps and paper towels. And he saw the blood, faint, almost invisible if you didn't know where to look. But Goss always knew where to look. A pale brown smear on the edge of the wooden table near the door, at the height of a seated person's face, wiped clean, but old wood absorbed faster than a wet cloth could erase. He sat down on a bar stool, placed both hands on the oak surface, and looked at Jolene with eyes that carried no threat at all, only exhaustion and something almost like understanding. "Good morning, Jolene," he said, his voice gentle, ordinary, like a regular customer stopping in for coffee. "I heard the place got a little loud last night." Jolene set the cloth down and looked straight into Goss's eyes. She didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't lower her head. She looked at him with amber brown eyes, still carrying the fatigue of last night but no longer carrying fear. And she answered in a flat, clear voice, every word measured. "3 customers got drunk, made noise, then left." Goss chewed his gum, slowly. He looked at Jolene for 2 more seconds. Then he looked down at her bandaged wrist, then up at the swollen lip beneath the lipstick, then back into her eyes. "Got drunk, then left," he repeated, slowly, word by word, chewing his gum between each word, not asking, not confirming, only repeating it as if placing 2 versions of the truth side by side on the bar for them both to look at, the version Jolene had just spoken, and the version being told by the bandaged wrist and the broken door bolt. Then Goss looked out the window. Across the street, beneath a leafless birch tree covered in snow, a black SUV was parked close to the curb. Barrett Mancini sat in the driver's seat, the window lowered partway despite the cold. A morning newspaper open across the steering wheel, and in the cup holder beside the passenger seat, a paper cup gave off a faint curl of steam. The kind of cup from the small tea shop at the end of the block that Goss knew sold only one kind of tea. Chamomile. A former Marine, 2 tours in Fallujah, weighing more than 118 kilograms, with a frame as solid as a brick wall, was sitting in an armored vehicle at 10 o'clock in the morning outside a little bar, drinking chamomile tea and reading the newspaper. Goss turned back to Jolene. He chewed his gum 3 more times. 22 years on the job had taught him many things, but the most important one was knowing when to dig deeper and when to know enough. There were cases you dug into because justice needed to be served, and there were cases where you knew enough because justice had already been served, just not by your system. This was a moment for knowing enough. "Jolene," Goss said, pulling a small card from his coat pocket and setting it on the oak bar beside the stack of wages Denise had placed there last night, and Jolene still hadn't put away. "If you need anything, anytime, you call me." Then he stood, zipped up his coat, pulled a gray knit cap onto his head, and walked out the door. He passed Barrett's black SUV without stopping, without looking in, without nodding. Barrett didn't lift his eyes from the newspaper. The 2 men passed each other in complete silence, 2 banks of the same river, recognizing each other without greeting, understanding each other without speaking. Goss walked along the snow-covered sidewalk, chewing his gum, and he knew. He knew the 3 men last night hadn't just gotten drunk and left. He knew the door bolt hadn't bent itself. He knew a phone didn't throw itself into a wall. He knew the blood on the table edge wasn't tomato sauce. But he also knew those 3 men wouldn't come back. Never. Not because they were afraid of the police, because they were afraid of the black SUV parked across the street with the man drinking warm drink inside. And sometimes, on the sloping streets that led down to the harbor, where the law arrived slower than the bay wind, where the nearest precinct was 28 minutes away, in dry road conditions, and 35 minutes if snow was falling. That was the best justice the system could hope for. Not perfect, not clean, not found in any textbook, but enough. When the long night finally came to an end, Jolene stepped out into the dark parking lot, holding her breath against the cold. She walked toward her usual parking spot, and as the amber light from a nearby streetlight cut through the falling snow, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her old, rusted Honda Civic was nowhere to be seen. In its exact place stood a much newer Honda Civic, catching the yellow glow the very same silver color, but clean, polished, and completely free of rust. Confused and with her heart pounding, Jolene reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. As she pulled it open, the fresh scent of a new car washed over her, and there, resting on the pristine driver's seat, was a small envelope. Inside, her trembling fingers found a brand new car key, official registration papers already bearing the name Jolene Caldwell, and a folded note. The handwriting was neat, sharp, 7 words. "Penny needs mom home safely every night." Underneath, a single letter, V. Jolene sank into the driver's seat of the new car, clutching the note tightly against her chest, as the tears she had held back all night finally spilled over. She hadn't cried when Shane's hand struck her face, hadn't cried when Cody aimed the gun at her, hadn't cried when the darkness crashed down, or when Bert held her in the quiet bar. She cried now because those 7 words told her something no one had acknowledged in 2 long years, that someone had truly seen her, not seen the waitress, not seen the widow, not seen the burden, seen Jolene, the person she was. She wiped her tears, tucked the note into the pocket of her coat, close to her chest, started the new car, and the engine caught on the first try. Smooth, clean, with no praying, no holding her breath. For the first time in years, she drove home with a peaceful mind, knowing she was no longer alone in the dark. 1 week after that night, Jolene drove back to the Amber Glass to begin her first evening shift, since everything had happened. She stopped in front of the bar and lifted her head. The neon sign had been fixed. The letter G glowed bright, amber red, blinking steadily in rhythm with the other letters. The Amber Glass. Complete. For the first time in more than 6 months, inside, the bar was different too. The wooden floor had been polished again, the scrape had vanished, and the front door bolt had been replaced. Denise was no longer there. She had quit. No one asked why, and her absence felt like the absence of a toothache. You only realized it was gone when you found yourself breathing easier. The new manager was a quiet, middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that weren't cold, the kind of person who shook hands firmly, paid wages on time, and never hid in the office when trouble came. Jolene's shift was adjusted, starting 1 hour later and ending 1 hour earlier, just enough for her to go home, rest, and take Penny to therapy every morning without racing against the clock. The pay was higher. The tips weren't cut. Jolene asked who the new owner was. The new manager smiled faintly. An LLC. I haven't met whoever's behind it. I only know they want the bar to run well and the staff to be treated decently. Jolene didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. And every night she worked, Barrett's black SUV parked across the street, from the moment she arrived until her taillights disappeared at the end of the street. Barrett didn't come into the bar. He only sat in the car, reading the newspaper, drinking hot tea, and keeping his quiet vigil until she safely reached her door at the end of each shift. Jolene knew he was there. No one said anything. But every night, when she saw the shadow of that black SUV beneath the yellow streetlight, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Safe. Now, every morning at 9 o'clock, Jolene held Penny's hand and walked down the hallway of the speech therapy center. The little girl's tiny footsteps made soft tapping sounds against the white tile floor. Captain the teddy bear tucked under her arm, her pink canvas shoes with stars stepping steadily beside her mother's old sneakers. Penny held Jolene's hand with her whole tiny palm, gripping it tightly, trustingly, the kind of grip that belonged to a child completely certain that the person leading her would never let go. In front of the therapy room door, Penny looked up at her mother with wide amber brown eyes, exactly like her mother's. Is Mom happy? Her voice was small, clear, each syllable distinct. That voice had been paid for with hundreds of hours of practice, hundreds of therapy sessions, hundreds of exhausted nights, when Jolene mixed cocktails so her daughter would never have to miss a single appointment. Jolene knelt down, wrapped her arms around her daughter, and whispered into the little girl's brown curls, still smelling of children's shampoo. Very happy, sweetheart. Mom is very happy. And she truly was. Not because everything was all right, but because she was here. Because this morning she was kneeling in a therapy center hallway holding her daughter instead of lying somewhere she didn't dare imagine. Jolene knew Nico Valentini wasn't a saint. She knew the hands that had folded the note with 7 words and left it on her car seat were also hands that had done things she didn't want to imagine. But on that night, when the manager locked herself inside the office, when the police were 28 minutes away by car, when the whole world turned its back, those hands were the only ones that reached out. And maybe that was the real lesson of this story. Not about the mafia, not about violence, but about respect, the kind of currency that isn't printed on paper but is worth more than all of it. Jolene didn't do anything extraordinary. She only treated people like human beings, even the ones society had already decided weren't human. She returned $15,000 when no one was watching. She made a drink for a man sitting alone on Christmas Eve, not because she was afraid, but because she believed no one should be lonely on the night when the whole world gathered together. And that simple, ordinary respect came back to save her exactly when she needed it most. In the shape of 3 seconds of darkness. In the shape of a black SUV parked across the street every night. In the shape of 7 handwritten words on a small piece of paper. Never judge anyone by the label society has pasted onto them. And never underestimate the person pouring your drink. You never know who is sitting at the next table. Did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every comment is motivation for us to keep bringing meaningful stories to you every day. If you think this story is worth hearing for someone you love, hit like and share it with them, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. I wish all of you good health, days that feel truly complete, and a heart that always stays open enough to give respect, because you never know when it might come back to save you. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.